talk about the shift in those terms, when we see that clearly an athlete, from an intent and a direction standpoint, we've narrowed out those things, especially when we have different archetypes. The performance aspect becomes where we want to spend and where we can gain a lot of bang for our buck. In those regards, we see, and I showed earlier, that's what you'd ask for in a shift. Head over. And once again, we're going to have athletes that are hip archetypes 1 and 2. And they are the true athletes, the ones that, regardless of where their body is in space, they understand how to get on top of that foot. You're going to have very few athletes that are able to do this, but they will be there. And those are things you have to understand. Those are more outliers, meaning they don't exist in a general sense. And your coaching comes from those of the general sense, and then recognizing those who are outliers. So in both perspectives, you can address this in two ways. One, we can look at it as, hey, we'd love a kid, whether they're hip archetype 1, 2, or 3, be able to shift, and when they're foot to foot, the head is directly over that foot. That's a good shift in terms of what we're seeing from the back and their body position moving. Now we talk about the performance aspect of that space, because these initial pitches for her, when we first tested, we look at, like we've talked about within the moments of the shift, we've done the side and the rear view. We know what's happening here. We've discussed it already. So now when we measure that, when I measured that on her force plates, what we got to see was the objective and the goal of the shift, as we talked about, was that when that back leg gets to 0, when there's no weight on it, and then right about before we see that peak, the athlete is missing a considerable amount of weight into her foot. So what that's doing is that's limiting energy transfer all the way down the chain, from the shift to the third transfer, which is putting that weight and energy back into the rubber. That means that there's an opportunity here that I want to go ahead and make trainable, and this is where the performance aspect of it comes by. It's because I don't want to necessarily move on just because she does shift decently from a visual standpoint. There is room and low-hanging fruit to be able to see that these small adjustments, the likelihood that she's getting the most out of what she's doing isn't true. Why? Because even though we see the skeleton moving, there's a very big difference between can I do something and am I doing something from a performance aspect. Is it my best performance? Just because I can do it doesn't mean I'm gaining performance. And we see the testing revealed that, yeah, that's an issue. And we can see that when we look, like we've talked about in the other videos, from those spaces and places, that the athlete here, there's that hyperextension, the scrape of the foot, meaning there was no real direction. So those things become important. Like I said, there's the initial aspect of the explanation of what energy is doing for the athlete and helping them understand the flow of energy in their pitch. And then once they're aware, now you'll have athletes, in like this case, an example of ones that like, hey, well, I want to do much better there. They see their chart and they're like, okay, how do we improve that so that everything else down the chain becomes better? So when we look at those pieces, the first place we went to for her was understanding from that drop and from that shift standpoint, the athlete is going to school. I haven't done anything pitching wise from her. She's just coming in for the summer before she goes to university, to ASU, and looking to get the most out of what she's already doing. Has a pitching coach. So the first thing we do is we talk about those shifts. When we have hip archetypes 1 and 2, we'll talk about this in the wrap-up and the performance. We'll do our shifts from a more dynamic space, because rockers, those are going to have better sensations, especially hip archetype 2s and our older athletes like we talked about, feeling the left foot move. So instead of standing from the typical static position where we would just shift into that front shoe, I have a lot of rockers, especially ones I'm not going to have time to really function on hip archetype 3 or those types of things. Or like I said, the return on investment isn't there at that point. She specifically said, I don't really try to drive with my back foot. I really try to get onto my front foot. Okay, so let's take advantage of that shift. Getting her to understand what a knee bend felt like and what that weight felt like was important. So we would couple her shifts with then understanding what it felt like to have real pressure and weight into that drive foot. So now she's loading that right hip, which is in a sense where it would be loaded in her pitch. She's shifted in this position right here. If we just moved it around a little, would look like what we just saw with the running back shift with the football, or the dynamic shift. I just call it running back because they hold the football. But she's experienced tension and load, and then how to move out of and work out of that tension. And this is just in a variation of our kickstand lunge, of our kickstand RDL, and we're just using her front foot instead of her back foot because I want her to understand what pressure feels like in those moments. Other variable exercises we did, her warm-up changed. We started doing the warm-up I've shown a lot where we warm up the knee and hip joint by doing our slow DKE hops on a single and double leg. And she absolutely hated these. The first time she did them, we could not finish the lesson, and this is the warm-up. And so it goes to help us understand that warm-ups are really good areas and barriers of entry into what we want the athlete to accomplish. And once they get used to the warm-up, then it becomes an easy transition because we're building capacity for them to do this hundreds of times in games. This isn't someone who was weak. She's been lifting for 3 to 4 times a week for the last 3 to 4 years. Very good, for her size, very good sprinter. She's just pitches only, but she's a good athlete. And she was cooked after this. Could not, funny story, she went home, told her parents, I'm going to call the personal trainer. What has he been doing all this time? But it's because strength is one thing. The ability to express strength in certain positions is another. And because more of her pitch didn't focus on that shift where she's loading the tissue throughout the whole limb, we had to give her experience of it every time she was in session through her warm-up. And then we got to the exercises that you saw earlier. Here's another one. Again, the band is helping assist the hinge. She doesn't have to do anything, but the only cue for me here is I just want you to feel load in the hip and then your thigh working back into the shoe crease. And we're just expressing, feeling that tension. So she's understanding how to couple. Hey, using the football helps you experience what the shift is. And then we get to the space where, okay, this is what it's going to be like when you're on that single leg even more as your body weight has moved forward a little bit. And so those were things that we used to accompany for her. And those were the changes that elicited from a performance aspect. We started to see on her force plates more and more weight. And visibly, you're able to, once again, see those changes on the performance side very, very clearly here. Talked about it, less scraping. We're just going through it. If I can't load it, there's nothing for me to really feel myself relatively push through. 2 entirely different moments for this athlete now. 2 entirely different postures, a very different way of getting somewhere in both instances. And this is a perfect example of how, say you're in the setting, I know most of you are not going to be in this particular setting, when we get athletes that are newer, really understanding the athlete first and where they're at in space, talking to her about, hey, I don't really push with my back leg. Okay, that's fine. But the drop and shift still exist, so we need to be prepared for that weight and that pressure. And once we got to the shift portion and we saw what wasn't happening for her, we wanted to enhance it and be able to get her to realize it and be able to make it happen in her pitch as moments of reference, and then giving her the adequate strength work and other in bullpen session work to be able to experience that performance side. So to summarize from this space is, as we move on with these energy transfers, especially here in the drive portion of it, what we're looking at is consistency in the actual moment and recognition of the moment. So the drop and the shift, those moments are happening. Can we recognize when they happen? And then can we get in better position to maximize them? And then the ultimate goal is, after that, the performance piece. What are we doing to maximize that? And can we understand it? Not necessarily need to be able to teach it within each lesson, because you're not going to be able to do this with every kid. But in regards to the assessments we're taking with them, giving them understandings of, hey, your progression and template, once you get good at this is the things you should start to see yourself kind of incorporating in your weight room, in those types of things. So